In this lecture, I want to give you a brief history of the events and influences that led to the modern art movements of the early 20th century. This will lay the groundwork to understand the ideological and the philosophical thinking and the aesthetic changes that took place in the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain and spread throughout the rest of the Western world in the 18th and 19th centuries. It changed human society. It began roughly around 1760. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Before the machine age, we were a rural agrarian culture. Farmlands consisted of family units who worked the land and produced their own livelihood. The shift happened in the late 18th century, and the advent of the steam-powered machines had an effect which produced a shift to an urban manufacturing society. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. How many of you saw director Danny Boyle's opening ceremony of the London Olympics? In that, the director showed us how Great Britain went from grassy fields to soot-covered cities. And what resulted was, with no government intervention or regulations, were basically industrial wastelands. Man went from farm to factory. Man and beast in the fields to technology and machines in the cities. Now, the next series of images and photographs were taken by documentary photographer Hein. He documented America in the early part of the 20th century, and through his photography, he played a key role in changing American society for the better. Laws, for example, laws protecting children in industries, were just one result of his photographic efforts. This photo, which is titled Powerhouse Mechanic Working on Steam Pump, was shot in 1920. It's a commentary that captures the notion of man as an appendage to the machine. Here Hein documents the urban landscape of industrialization. In the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century, we began to see a reaction to the repercussions of the unbridled industrialization of the world. All aspects of the human condition were irrevocably altered. Before the formation of unions and labor laws, man worked unceasing hours 7 days a week, and there was no leisure time. None. 7 days a week, 12-hour days. Factory production changed the way mankind worked. It changed the family structure completely. What once was a team working together on their farm, where the mother could care for the young, but still be a part of the economy of the family and the home, it became ruptured. Away from the structure of a large home on the farm, families moved to the cramped, overcrowded tenement homes in the cities to be close to the factories. And what resulted were these overcrowded living spaces with no running water, no power. Basically, what we saw was the population double every 10 years in the 19th century as apartments designed for one family were divided up for many families to share. So, along with work and leisure, transportation changed with inventions like the steam engine. Suddenly, we saw railways that connected us from one part of the continent to another in a fraction of the time that it once took. What happened as a result is what we refer to as the speed up of communication. Everything began to move faster, especially news that traveled from one place to another. Ideas traveled from place to place much quicker. And it continues today with technology advances. Now communication is instantaneous. A new class system developed, the working class. Here we see some of those images that Hein was documenting. We see children working in factories. And this was before child labor laws prohibited it. This new class system in the West had a great impact on modernism in the arts and the intellectual underpinnings of modernism that we will be studying in this semester. So there was no more leisure time. People worked 12-hour days in these grueling jobs, 7 days a week. Families that once worked together on the farm spent all of their time apart. As men and children went off to factory jobs, women stayed home to raise the young children. Trade increased exponentially, and the world became a much smaller place. The expansion of manufacturing and trade created a global society. Industrialization impacted 20th century thinking and avant-garde modernism, but there were other events that took place and impacted late 19th century and 20th century art and design. Let's go to 17th century Japan. Fearing colonial expansion and the impact of Christian missionaries on Japanese culture, the shogun, which was the ruling military class of Japan, excluded all foreigners in the 17th century. They did not just discourage, but they excluded them officially from entering the country. Their official policy was national seclusion, and Japan developed for 200 years in isolation. Now, this was possible because Japan has a natural border. It's surrounded by water. This creates a natural barrier. So again, for 200 years, Japan had developed in isolation with no influence from Western ideas. Now, what does this affect? They developed culturally, they developed politically, and important to our studies in graphic design, they developed aesthetically. They developed separate from any outside influences in these areas, cultural, political, and aesthetic. Japanese art acquired a character with few outside influences. Until this man, American Navy Commander Matthew C. Perry. He sailed into Edo Bay in 1853, which is Tokyo today. And after extensive talks in 1854, Japan signed a treaty with America to open a few of its ports to the west. Japan's borders had been opened after 200 years of isolation. And so Japan's borders opened to foreign commerce. This changes both Japan, which eventually evolved into an industrial nation, and it also changed the Western world, which was suddenly exposed to Japan after 200 years of isolation. As a result of the sudden exposure to the culture of Japan, the aesthetics of Japan, there was a mania in the West for all things Japanese. Because the aesthetics and form was so radically different than anything that had gone before and had been established in basically the 400-year-old Renaissance period in the West, this rupture of the East impacted the aesthetics of the West. Artists and architects began collecting prints and decorative arts that were imported from Japan. Many of these artists and designers and architects traveled to Japan to study its architecture, to study its religion, to study its aesthetics. In 1872, a new term was coined by a French art critic, and it described eventually a new field of study, Japanisme. Japanisme is defined as a deep influence of Japanese aesthetic, which significantly changed the palette, the style, and or sometimes the subject matter. So let's take a look at two portraits, one Eastern and one Western. Now, we'll do a compare and contrast. First, let's compare. Now, they're both portraits, and they are both portraits of women, specifically individual women, but that's pretty much where the comparison ends. On the left, we have a portrait of a courtesan, and on the right, the Mona Lisa. The Eastern artist is concerned with line, flat color, patternization. The Western artist, Leonardo da Vinci clearly, is modeling with light and shade, what we call chiaroscuro. The East is created through stylization, flatness of form, instead of a fully developed one-point perspective. One is perceptual, that's the Mona Lisa. It is a representation of what the artist saw. The courtesan, however, is not perceptual as much as it is conceptual. It is what the mind's eye sees. Her face is defined with a few simple lines. She is what we call an abstraction of form, or more conceptual than the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is perceptual and representational, and the courtesan is conceptual and more abstract. Also, they are two very different media. The one on the left is a print, meaning It is multiples. There are many of these. It is reproduced in an edition. Printed editions can be distributed to the masses, and they exist in many places at once. This is key to our discipline of mass communication and graphic design. In the one on the right, we see a unique, one of a kind. It's a painting. Now, I know recently we have discovered there's another Mona Lisa, but each are unique and one of a kind. This is hanging in the Louvre in Paris, and you can wait in a long line, and go into a crowded room to stand and from a very far distance get a glimpse of this work of art. But it is a unique work of art. It is in one place. So these prints we've been talking about from Japan are called Yukioi prints, and they became well distributed throughout Europe and abroad after Japan opened its borders. They are mass-produced, colored woodblock prints. And these prints are produced by teams of masters. There is an artist who designed the prints and laid it out. There is a carver who crafted the blocks and hewn each block out of wood, and a master printer who laid the ink on the surface of the blocks and transferred those to paper. So these were mass-produced colored woodcuts. Early prints were scenes of kabuki theater plays, of actors in the plays. There were geishas and courtesans, as well as erotica. We'll see how this subject matter influences the subject matter of the Impressionist artists. These were popular prints that were mass-produced in Japan, and they were seen as cheap ephemera. But in the West, these prints were collected. They became collector's items. So they were popular in Japan during the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, Yukioi means pictures of the floating world. The floating world was the entertainment district of Edo, which is modern Tokyo, and other cities like Kyoto. Floating refers to the world of everyday life, especially the life of pleasure. So, for example, theater, the dance halls, the street festivals. Courtesans and erotica were part of the floating world. Let's take a look at some examples of Yukioi prints. On the left is the print titled The Year in Festival in Edo, created in 1853 by Ando Hiroshige. This is a woodblock print, and it shows the density of the festival and the street life in the floating world. The print on the right shows the stage, the flamboyance of the stage and the theater, and the audience bustle that made kabuki an urban sensation. It shows the runways that extend through the audience, that brought the audience and the actors closer together. Danjuri V was a public figure. He was a matinee idol, and so the public was crazy about their matinee idols, the way we are today about our stars. And so this print is of the famous actor Danjuro V. He was in over 140 performances. He was a lover, he was a hero, he was a villain, and at times he even played women, as they often did in kabuki theater. Here's another print called Hana Katsura. The subject matter is the Madame Hana Katsura, and she's standing in a doorway of her establishment, lit by a lantern. The words on the lantern give the name of the place and its address in the Yoshiwara district of Edo. This was Edo's biggest red light district. So she's a madame, and she's running a brothel with courtesans. This example is significant to us as designers, and the reason I'm showing it to you is because we see with this style of art, the calligraphic line that defines the image works beautifully with the calligraphic words. So in this aesthetic, words begin to combine seamlessly with image. The flat two-dimensionality of both stylistically fit together, and that is significant to us as designers. Western artists were inspired by this new aesthetic. The calligraphic line drawing, the two-dimensional space, or flat space, the abstraction and simplification of the form, the flat use of color, and the beautiful use of patternization, as you see here, the bold, bright colors as well. Later, ukiyo-e prints expanded the subject matter beyond the red light district and the pleasure district of the ukiyo-e prints. They included nature. The natural world is inherent in the national religion of Japan, the Shinto religion. Nature is deeply rooted in this religion and, in turn, Japanese culture. So we see that in the ukiyo-e prints. One of Japan's great masters was Katsushika Hokusai. Hokusai created a series of prints titled 35 Views of Mount Fuji. This is titled South Wind, Clear Dawn, printed in 1830. Mount Fuji had been a subject in Japanese painting for centuries before it became a subject for ukiyo-e prints. Here's another print by Hokusai, Mount Fuji, 1831. Note how the subject matter of Mount Fuji is simplified and flattened. Sometimes they achieved great, beautiful gradation through the inking of these blocks. Many of these prints used as many as 50, that's 50 wood blocks to create one print. So these were works of great mastery. These simplified shapes became important to Western printmakers and poster designers. They found new approaches to space, to color, and to drawing conventions that were radically unlike their Western roots. Because images were flat color and they were created with calligraphic lines, this graphic style was able to establish a visual unity between type and image. Now combine that idea with new Western print technologies and innovations because of the industrial age, and suddenly you have a poster boom in the West. Let's talk about those technologies. In the 1890s, we began to see color lithography. Let me tell you about this printing technique. It's a different technology than the ukiyo-e prints, the woodblock printmaking. The technology of the woodblocks is what we refer to as relief printing. A raised surface is inked with woodblock printing, with relief printing. The surface is raised, and that is inked and transferred to a sheet of paper through pressure. Now, lithography is different. Lithographic printmaking is based on the physical principle that oil and water don't mix. Oil repels water, and water repels oil. And that's what this printing technique is based on. This is the lithographic process. Now, you can see in the top photo a stone that is the surface for the artwork. There, the artist is drawing directly on the surface of the stone with a grease pencil, something similar to a crayon. Next, he will wash the surface with water, and the marks that he's made on the stone repel the water. When ink is applied, it's only applied to the marks that he's made because the water's repelled it everywhere else. And the transferred ink to the paper that you see below is only transferred from the marks that he's made on the stone. And that is the lithographic process. Each stone is created for a separate color. Now, this technology became a dominant creative force in the late 19th century. We still use this technology today in offset lithography. We just don't work with a stone, we work with metal plates. Magazines use this principle, for example. This became nothing less than a revolution. In the beginning, it was used to transfer originals. For example, it took an original work of art and it transferred through lithography the work of art to a print. It was never intended to produce original works in and of itself as a medium, but it was used as a reproduction process only, until this artist and printmaker made it accessible. Jules Cheret. This print was created in 1889. Cheret began to reinstate color lithography as a creative and artistic medium. What is significant about Cheret is he was both a technician and an artist. He was fascinated in experimenting with the tools of lithography and with how this technology could evolve aesthetically. Cheret was a force behind the explosion of the poster boom. He produced the first poster for the Moulin Rouge, a dance club in Paris, that you see here. Notice how the figures, though, are still slightly modeled within a three-dimensional environment. And he's using illusionistically projecting letter forms. We will see over time how this eventually changes. In 1869, Charest introduced a creative system of three-color lithographic printing stones. And so he created three separate stones to create his new poster technique. He used one stone for black, another to give a touch of red, and the third to harmonize the strong red by means of a gradated background. So you see here cool tones at the top and warm tones at the bottom with a gradation between them. That's actually one stone that creates that gradation. And it's inked with the cool tones to the warm tones going down. Now, prior to the development of Charest's integrated system, lithographic posters were either black and white or the three colors black, red, and blue that were used to accentuate just essential parts in the poster. So nothing that was an overall color like you see here. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, another artist that embraced color lithography, had a slightly different process for his posters. He, very much inspired by Yukioi prints, introduced flat color and emphasized a two-dimensional flatness of the form. He also worked with a calligraphic line, as you see here, and silhouetted shapes. No drop shadows in his work, and none on the letter forms as well. This is Toulouse-Lautrec's first poster, which introduced this bold simplification of form, space, and composition to a Western audience, something that he learned from the Japanese printmakers. A calligraphic line that you see in the froth of the dancer's petticoat, and you also see it in the foreground figure. Abstraction of form in the silhouettes of the onlooking crowd. And he also drew on the subject matter of the Yukioi prints. These, the Moulin Rouge, the dance halls of Paris, and these were similar to the streets of Edo. Also, his use of flat color was inspired by the Yukioi prints. Stylistically, it was a dramatic break from the past, and it was a stylistically dramatic break from the work of Charest. It showed not only a new phase in the development of French poster art, but also in the process of lithography. Eugene Grassi created also in this popular medium book art, The Four Sons of Aimon, which was a popular romance novel in France. The story dates back to the 15th century. This is one of the most notable early books of color printing. The book was of major importance in the history of creative book illustration, as well as the development of the color movement in lithography. The process actually predates the halftone dot that's used in printing today. It is a continuous tone, is created using a process called photogravure. It's similar to an etching plate where the tones are etched out of a copper plate. Ink then fills the incisions that are made through the etching process, and then the ink transfers with the pressure of the press to the paper. Grassi was essentially a decorative artist who created designs for furniture and tapestries, for glass windows, fabrics. He worked in typography. He was what we refer to as an artist craftsman. And it's no wonder that Grassi relished the concept of artfully illustrated book design and the process of photocolor relief mass-printed books. He was an early producer of artistic color lithographic posters, and his is on the left next to a Toulouse-Lautrec. So we can see clearly a stylistic difference in Grassi, who's still modeling with light and shade, to Toulouse-Lautrec with his flat color and his simplified line work on the right. Notice how Toulouse-Lautrec combines word and image, how they're integrated with the curvilinear line. The accumulation of a body of work by these young avant-garde artists makes it apparent that the medium of color lithography was the prime vehicle for the innovative printmaking in the late 1890s. Another prolific lithographic poster artist, Théophile Alexander Steinert, was possibly, in terms of public visibility, one of the most prolific lithographic poster artists of the late 1880s and 1890s. His work was seen everywhere. In just 7 short years between 1883 to 1900, he produced illustrations for over 100 books, approximately 2,000 illustrations for 50 different journals, close to 200 lithographic music sheets, which was another form of ephemera that these young artists could produce and work in to distribute to the masses. He produced more than 300 individual lithographs and etchings, and 36 of these lithographic posters that you see here. This is one of his favorite subject matters, cats, and they showed up in many of his illustrations and posters. This is the famous Le Chat Noir. His cover illustrations for the journal Gil Blas reached an average weekly audience of 200,000. So, needless to say, his work was prolific. Now, he was also very concerned in his work with the plight of the working class. Much of his subject matter was devoted to this social cause. He saw his position as a successful visual communicator, and he saw that as a way to change the injustice of the social structure. He used his role to convey the social messages about the working class, about the humanity of the street, the uneducated, the exploited. These were pervasive in the subject matter of Steinlet's art. These photos that you see here are by French photographer Eugene, capturing the streets of Paris. And the reason I show you these is because another impact on the poster boom in France during the late 19th century was a law that was passed in 1881 on the freedom of the press. Basically, it lifted any restrictions and censorship that had been imposed on printed matter earlier. Essentially, it stated anyone found removing or destroying posters could be fined, imprisoned, or both. This little law liberated the production and distribution of posters, and it facilitated the growth of a vast new industry. Notice Atte's photos of the posters wallpapering, in both of these images, wallpapering Paris. And this is what happened as a result of the passing of this law. As a result of the advances in printing technologies, the inspiration of a new aesthetic and new aesthetic approaches coming out of Japan, the laws that supported mass communication and the print medium. So the modern print was no longer a facsimile, but a personal conception, something that was realized for its own sake. And so original color lithography was born, and a simple sheet of paper attained a real value as an art form. Now, a small art critic who eventually published a catalog of these lithographic posters was Andre Malerio, and he wrote, I quote, "Any method or process which an artist develops to express himself is, for that very reason, legitimate." Print became a wonderful medium for young artists to express themselves and to reach the masses. So what we begin to see are these young avant-garde artists working primarily in this new medium. And we see it in many different forms of ephemera, one of which is the theater program. So the combination of color lithography and the theater program become just the right vehicle for these young artists to gain exposure. We begin to see, with the theater program, a fusion, joining theater performance with visual art. There was this wonderful collaboration between these new art movements in both visual and performing arts. The collaboration of the artists and the theater created a dialogue between these new movements in the visual and the performing arts. And in effect, it allowed this empathy between artists to express on paper, often in color. Edmond Sigaud became the poster man of the bookshop. He monopolizes the poster in his tiny shop in Paris in the 1890s. And it basically, his role was activated as the middleman, primarily by collaborating with Cheret, but eventually his shop was stocked full from floor to ceiling with these lithographic works of art. Not just the works of Cheret, but also the other young artists that were producing the posters of the day. His shop became one of the mainstays in Paris. He was essentially the middleman to what became a new industry. This original poster that you see here by Cheret was sold in Sigaud's shop as a limited edition. He printed in the quantity of 550. This is one of the rare Charets that was produced in 5 lithographic colors. So he used 5 stones to create this particular print. Now, an extraordinary explosion of avant-garde printmaking, fueled by these new approaches to color lithography, swept Paris and France at the turn of the century. Because these were editions, people could could afford to buy them. The working class could buy them. And they could buy them as works of art, something beautiful that could decorate their homes. Artists like Toulouse-Lautrec worked in many different media. He created posters, he created covers for publications, he produced theater programs, just to name a few. And in 1895, avant-garde printmaking rapidly multiplied. Printmaking and color lithography were basically synonymous. So, Western artists like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec's brilliant assimilation of Japanese woodblock prints led him to forge a poster style free of Western perspective and modeling. Here are two more of his prints where he used flat form, where he used calligraphic line. His subject matters were in the dance halls, at the Moulin Rouge. They were of celebrities or idols in France. One was May Milton on the right, printed in 1895. Notice how he creates a marriage of letter form to image. Notice how he has laid in both of these posters the image on top of the word. And that creates this cohesion, this cohesive unit between word and image. Here's another where we can see each dancer distinctly a character with just the simple line. He's able to capture their personality, their character traits. He creates the movement, the calligraphic froth of the dresses. He's highlighting the legs with bold black. Now, an American artist, Will Bradley, introduced this new aesthetic in the United States. He, too, was clearly inspired by Japanese woodblock prints and the Japanese style. Here we see a poster promoting the chapbook, which was a literary magazine produced by Will Bradley. In this poster, he's using simplified, abstracted characters, flat color, a curvilinear line. He treats his typography slightly different, in more of a masthead, the way you would see on a publication. But nevertheless, his work is inspired by the Japanese Yukioi print. And nothing's more apparent than Bradley's poster for one of his books. It is a peacock motif, and it's similar to the Yukioi print Peacock and Peonies by Utagawa, or Ando Hiroshige. He went by both names. So you see here Bradley's poster is similar in both subject matter and composition to the Hiroshige Yukioi print on the right. In the next lecture, we will look at what began to develop throughout Europe and America, a new art that briefly flourished at the turn of the 20th century in both architecture and interior design, also in the decorative arts throughout Europe and America. We'll take a look at that in our next lecture.